The horseshoe prints circled the clearing 3 times before stopping at the edge of the cypress grove. Sheriff Thomas Vickers knelt in the mud on the morning of September 19, 1872, studying marks that made no sense. 27 horses had ridden in. 26 had ridden out. The missing animal stood 15 yards away, reins trailing in black water, saddle empty except for a hood nailed through the pommel with a railroad spike. The fabric was still damp with something darker than swamp water. Vickers had been a Confederate cavalry scout. He knew terrain, knew tracking, knew when land had been worked into a weapon. Every trail leading deeper into the grove showed fresh boot prints heading in. None showed prints coming out. His deputy refused to follow. The Klansmen's families would later tell the papers their men had gone to burn a witch. What they found instead was a woman who had spent 2 years turning 40 acres of Louisiana swamp into a killing ground, and the patience to wait for them to come. Miriam Boudreau lived in a shack that leaned toward the water like it was trying to drown itself. The structure sat on the last solid ground before Terrebonne Parish's western swamps swallowed the world in black water and tupelo roots. 1 room, tar paper roof, a porch that creaked warnings when strangers approached. She had built it herself in 1870, after she stopped being property and started being a problem. The nearest town was Grantville, population 412, 3 miles east on a road that turned to soup every time it rained. White folks in Grantville called her the Swamp Woman when they were being polite, other things when they weren't. Black folks in the quarter south of town called her Sister Miriam and brought her cornmeal, salt pork, and news. She accepted the first 2. The third she already knew. Before the war, Miriam had belonged to the Charbonnet plantation, 12 miles north. Records showed she'd been purchased in 1849 at age 9 from an estate sale in New Orleans. Classified as field labor, though the overseer's notes mentioned she had an unnatural facility with the woods. By 1861, she could track a man 3 days after rain, could tell you what he'd eaten by the scat he left, could disappear into terrain where bloodhounds turned in circles and gave up. The Union Army found that useful. When federal troops pushed up through southern Louisiana in 1863, Miriam walked into their camp outside Thibodaux and offered her services. Captain James Wickham's diary recorded the meeting. A Negro woman of perhaps 23 years presented herself this morning, claiming she could guide patrols through the bayous where Confederate irregulars hid. Lieutenant Morrison dismissed her. I did not. By week's end, she had led us to 3 rebel supply caches and 2 deserter camps. The men call her the Hound. She is the best scout I have ever known. For 2 years, Miriam ghosted through Confederate territory, marking routes, counting troops, identifying sympathizers. She learned every footpath, every dry crossing, every family that hid graycoats in their cellars. She kept the information filed in her head like courthouse records, names and faces and debts unpaid. The war ended. Miriam married a freedman named Joseph Boudreau in 1866. They bought 40 acres of swampland nobody wanted for $12 and a promise to clear it. They built the leaning shack, planted a kitchen garden on the only patch of earth that stayed dry, and tried to build something that resembled peace. It lasted 3 years. The Klan came to Terrebonne Parish in 1868, 6 months after federal troops pulled out. They called themselves the Knights of the White Camellia locally, but the hood was the same, the burning cross was the same, and the message was the same. Know your place or learn it bleeding. They rode on Tuesdays and Saturdays, 24 men in white robes and pointed hoods, visiting freedmen who'd testified against white men in court, or who'd bought land, or who'd forgotten to step off the sidewalk quickly enough. Sometimes they just visited because it had been a slow week and the violence needed feeding. The parish had no federal presence. The sheriff's office kept records of complaints, but rarely arrests. Judge Armand Chevalier, who presided over the parish circuit court, had been a Confederate officer and made no secret of his sympathies. The newspaper, the Grantville Weekly Register, reported each incident as nighttime disturbance or dispute between neighbors. Nobody used the word terror. Using accurate language would have required courage the town didn't possess. Joseph Boudreau made a mistake in February of 1870. He attended a Union League meeting in Grantville, where freedmen discussed registering to vote in the spring elections. Someone took names. 2 weeks later, on a Saturday night when fog lay thick enough to hide the moon, riders came to the shack at Swamp's Edge. Miriam was visiting her friend Delphine in the quarter that night, helping birth Delphine's fourth child. She returned at dawn to find Joseph tied to the porch post. They'd used rope and questions, the kind of questions designed to produce names of other Union League members. Joseph had given them nothing. The giving nothing had taken hours. She cut him down. He lived 3 more days, long enough to tell her the voices he'd recognized, the horses he'd seen, the man who'd led them. Long enough to make her promise she wouldn't let this stand. He died on February 23rd, 1870, with Miriam holding his hand and memorizing every detail he'd given her. The sheriff came the next day. Thomas Vickers was 48, gray-haired, and had learned during the war that survival meant knowing when to see and when to go blind. He looked at Joseph's body, looked at Miriam's face, and made careful notes in his incident book. Assault by unknown parties. We'll investigate. He never investigated. Miriam never expected him to. She buried Joseph under the live oak behind the shack, carved his name into the trunk with a hunting knife, and disappeared into the swamp. For 2 years, people wondered where she'd gone. Miriam didn't leave the swamp. She went deeper into it, into the 40 acres that legally belonged to her, but that nobody had ever bothered to explore, because land that floods 10 months a year is only valuable if you know how to use it. She built a second camp 3 miles in, on a hammock of solid ground ringed by black water and sawgrass. No trails led there. You reached it by boat, or by knowing which cypress roots would hold your weight and which would dump you into water deep enough to drown in. She brought supplies in stages: dried fish, cornmeal, rope, nails, 3 hunting knives, her husband's revolver, and the list. The list was in her head, but she scratched it into the bark of a dead cypress where she could see it every morning. 11 names. The men Joseph had identified before he died. The men whose voices he'd known, whose horses he'd recognized, whose silhouettes he'd described. Miriam added 2 more names through her own observation, watching who rode together, who drank together, who wore the same boots. 13 men had killed her husband. She intended to return the favor, but not quickly. Quick meant a shot in the dark and a rope around her own neck. Slow meant studying them the way she'd studied Confederate supply lines during the war. Patterns, habits, weaknesses. Where they went when they rode, where they went when they didn't. Who led, who followed, who looked over their shoulder. She spent 6 months just watching. She'd learned during the war that reconnaissance won more battles than bravery. She noted when they met, every first and third Tuesday at the old Mercier barn 4 miles south of town. She noted their routes, the roads they took to reach the barn. the paths they used for raids. She noted which ones rode alone sometimes, careless and confident. The first man died in August of 1870. His name was Robert Duchamp, owner of a failing rice mill, known for his temper and his debts. He'd been the one to tie the rope, Joseph had said, the one who'd pulled it tight and asked the questions. Duchamp's body was found 3 miles from town on the river road, his horse standing nearby, his hood nailed to a sweet gum tree. The hood was positioned at eye level, like someone wanted passers-by to see it clearly. Duchamp's throat had been opened with something sharp and precise. The coroner's report, filed August 9, 1870, noted homicide by person or persons unknown, no witnesses, no arrest forthcoming. The Klan sent riders to investigate. Miriam watched them from a blind she'd built in a live oak's lower branches. They circled, confused by tracks that led in 3 directions and disappeared into water. Eventually, they left. She noted which ones looked frightened and which ones looked angry. Fear was useful. Anger made mistakes. 12 names remained. The second man died in October. Marcel Thibodeau, a sharecropper with Confederate sympathies and a fondness for burning out families who'd testified against whites. He'd held Joseph down, according to the list in Miriam's memory. Thibodeau vanished while checking his trap lines in the eastern swamp. His wife reported him missing after 3 days. Searchers found his pirogue overturned in shallow water, his hood nailed to a cypress stump nearby, his body bobbing face down 20 feet away. The rope around his neck suggested he'd been hanged before hitting the water, but the current made certainty impossible. The Weekly Register reported it as accidental drowning during nighttime hunting. Nobody mentioned the hood. The third man died in December, 2 days before Christmas. Etienne Broussard, who'd brought the rope. They found him in his barn, strung from the hayloft beam with his own lariat, hood positioned on a hay bale below him like an audience of one. The family insisted it was murder, but Sheriff Vickers noted evidence of heavy drinking and financial troubles. Ruled suicide. Filed December 23, 1870. Nobody looked for other explanations because the alternative meant admitting what was happening. 3 Klansmen dead in 5 months, each one found with his hood displayed like evidence at trial. Each death isolated, different enough to avoid obvious pattern but similar enough that men who knew began sleeping with loaded guns and checking shadows. The Klan held an emergency meeting in January of 1871. 40 men attended, including the parish's Grand Cyclops, a plantation owner named Gaston Fortier, who'd served as a Confederate major and believed the social order required violent maintenance. Minutes from that meeting don't exist. The Klan kept few records they couldn't burn quickly, but 3 men who attended later gave testimony that painted the scene. Fortier stood before the assembled knights and acknowledged 3 deaths. He called them unfortunate accidents, possible retaliation by unknown freedmen, nothing organized. But his voice carried doubt. Someone asked about the hoods, why each man's hood appeared at his death site, positioned deliberately. Fortier said it was meant to frighten them, to make them think they were being hunted. His answer to fear was more violence, more raids, more demonstrations that white power in Terrebonne Parish remained absolute. The raids increased. Every Saturday night through the spring of 1871, riders visited the Freedmen's Quarter in Grantville, burning shanties, beating men, assaulting women. They visited farms where black families had bought property, destroying crops and killing livestock. The violence was meant to restore order through terror, to remind the parish that the war's outcome hadn't changed fundamental realities. But the deaths didn't stop. Grantville's white citizens knew something was wrong. You couldn't have 4 Klansmen die in 8 months without noticing, even if you pretended each death was unconnected. But acknowledging a pattern meant acknowledging someone was hunting their neighbors, and that acknowledgement led to questions nobody wanted to answer. The Weekly Register continued its policy of euphemism. Tragic loss of upstanding citizens to misadventure and despair. Editor Harrison Pike, who'd watched the Klan burn his printing press in 1868 for criticizing their methods, had learned which stories stayed in his head and which ones made it to paper. The churches said nothing. Reverend Samuel Morton of First Baptist, where most Klansmen and their families worshipped, preached forgiveness and Christian charity, while his own deacons rode on Saturdays. Father Benoit at St. Anne's Catholic Church heard confessions from men who described their nighttime activities in abstract terms, defending community, maintaining order, and granted absolution without digging deeper. Moral courage would have cost them congregants and collection plates. The sheriff's office followed its pattern of elaborate blindness. Vickers documented each death, noted the suspicious circumstances, filed reports that went nowhere. His deputy, Marcus Guidry, was a Klansman himself, appointed because Vickers needed someone who could move between both worlds. Guidry's presence meant the sheriff always knew when raids were planned, but never quite arrived in time to stop them. The courts were worse. Judge Chevalier presided over a parish where justice bent toward those who'd worn Confederate gray. When freedmen brought complaints about nighttime visitors, burned homes, or stolen property, the judge required witnesses who hadn't fled in terror and evidence that hadn't been destroyed by fire. Convictions were rare, fines were light, and the message was clear. The law protected some people and policed others. What would you do standing in that courthouse, knowing your testimony meant a target on your back, knowing the men you'd accuse would ride free while you slept behind a barred door? The freedmen of Terrebonne Parish answered that question individually. Some testified anyway. Some left for New Orleans or Texas. Most stayed silent, calculated survival, and waited for something to change. Miriam watched all of it. She'd disappear from her swamp camp for days at a time, moving through Grantville at night, listening to conversations in the quarter, tracking who said what to whom. She learned which shopkeepers let Klansmen intimidate black customers, which doctors refused to treat freedmen, which lawyers wouldn't file deeds for black property owners. She kept these details filed alongside the list of names, understanding that the terror had infrastructure, and infrastructure had weak points. The 4th man died in April of 1871, Jean-Baptiste Hébert, who'd laughed while Joseph screamed. They found him in the canebrake east of town, his horse returned riderless, his hood nailed to a fence post near where the body lay. He'd been alive when something sharp had opened his femoral artery, bled out in the mud, alone, while his brothers were riding elsewhere. The Weekly Register didn't report it at all this time. Silence felt safer than admission. 10 names remained. Miriam's 40 acres became her university. She'd learned tracking during slavery, learned tactics during the war, but the swamp taught her patience and preparation. The land itself became her weapon. She spent months mapping every trail, every crossing, every patch of solid ground surrounded by deceptive water. She marked safe routes with notches on trees, visible only if you knew the pattern. She marked false trails with similar notches, slightly different, leading to places where the ground looked solid, but your boot went through into mud deep enough to hold you while the water rose. She dug pits along the most obvious approaches to her deeper camps, covering them with woven grass that looked like solid ground, until weight broke through. Not deep enough to kill, but deep enough to trap, to injure, to slow down anyone pursuing. She planted stakes at the bottom of some, not to impale but to puncture boots and introduce swamp water to open wounds. Infection did the rest. She studied the cypress groves where Spanish moss hung thick enough to hide platforms. She built blinds in the upper branches, 20 feet above the ground, invisible from below, with sightlines covering the approaches. A woman in a tree was just another shadow, especially at night, especially if she stayed motionless for hours. The swamp had rhythms, and she learned them. High water came in spring and fall. Summer brought mosquitoes and heat that made pursuit exhausting. Winter brought fog that reduced visibility to arm's length. She timed her movements around these rhythms, used them the way a sailor uses wind. She also learned chemistry from necessity. Certain plants, when crushed and mixed with water, produced compounds that caused violent illness. Not enough to kill quickly, but enough to disable. She'd learned this during the war, watching Union surgeons treat soldiers who'd eaten unfamiliar vegetation. She'd remembered which plants caused which symptoms, and now she applied that knowledge to wells and water barrels. The fifth man died in July. Claude Devereaux, who'd brought the torch they'd held to Joseph's skin. Found in his fields, convulsing, his horse standing nearby, his hood left on a fence post. The doctor called it seizure, possibly from bad liquor. Nobody tested the well Devereaux had drunk from that morning. The well 60 yards from his property line. The well that bordered the swamp where Miriam had access after dark. The sixth man died in September, hung from a bridge near the western parish line, his hood nailed to the railing. His name was Antoine Mouton. Joseph had named him as the one who'd asked about Union League meeting times, who'd wanted names of organizers. The rope around Mouton's neck was the same type used on Joseph. The symbolism was clear to anyone paying attention, though most chose not to. 9 names left. But the pattern had become obvious enough that even deliberate blindness couldn't hide it. Someone was hunting Klansmen. Someone who knew their identities, knew their routes, knew how to kill them individually before their brothers noticed they were gone. The whispers started. Not in the white churches or the courthouse or the newspaper. In the freedmen's quarter, in the shanties south of town, in the conversations that happened after dark when white folks couldn't hear. They spoke of Miriam Boudreau, the swamp woman, who disappeared after her husband died and hadn't been seen in town since. They spoke of hoods appearing at death sites like accusations. They connected facts that white Grantville refused to acknowledge. The white community developed their own explanation, one that required less admission. The swamp witch, they called her. A woman who'd made pacts with swamp spirits, who commanded alligators and water moccasins, who could appear and disappear like fog. Making it supernatural made it easier to dismiss, easier to handle. Admitting it was strategy and patience meant admitting a black woman was beating them. Gaston Fortier owned 1,800 acres of sugarcane and the mortgage on half of Grantville. He'd been 28 when he joined the Confederate cavalry, 32 when Appomattox ended the only world he'd wanted to live in. The Klan gave him structure and purpose. He'd risen to Grand Cyclops of the parish's chapter by 1869 through a combination of ruthlessness and connections. By the fall of 1871, 6 of his knights were dead under circumstances that strained coincidence. Fortier was not stupid. He recognized pattern even when others pretended blindness. Someone was killing his men, someone who knew their identities, someone who struck when they were isolated and vulnerable. He called another meeting in October, this one restricted to senior knights. 20 men attended at the Mercier barn, arriving separately, checking for watchers. Fortier addressed them standing near the barn's center post, a lantern casting his shadow large against the wall. "We have a problem," he said. "No euphemisms this time. Someone is hunting us. 6 dead in 14 months, each one found with his hood displayed. This is not accident. This is not divine judgment. This is murder, planned and executed by someone who knows us." He let that settle. Then he spoke the name nobody had said aloud in these gatherings. Miriam Boudreau. Joseph Boudreau's widow. The woman who disappeared after her husband died. The woman who lived at Swamp's Edge. The woman rumored to have guided Union patrols during the war. The woman with reason and skill to do exactly what was being done. "She's one woman," someone objected. "Living alone in a shack. How could one woman kill 6 men without being seen, without leaving trail?" Fortier had considered this. She was a scout during the war. She knows terrain and tactics. She's had 2 years to prepare. And she's been invisible because we've been looking for an enemy who looks like our enemies during the war. We expected freedmen organizing, expected revenge from groups, expected confrontation. She's given us none of that. She's given us isolation and precision. The room debated. Some knights argued for raids on black families, collective punishment to draw Miriam out. Fortier dismissed this. She won't trade herself for others. She's demonstrated that. She watches us hurt people and waits. Patience is her weapon. Others suggested leaving her alone, accepting the losses, avoiding her territory. This also failed. If we retreat from one woman, we admit weakness. Every freedman in the parish sees it. The entire structure collapses. Fortier proposed a third option. Overwhelming force. Not a raid party of 6 or 8 men, but the entire chapter. Every knight, every associate, every white man in the parish willing to ride. Surround her shack, burn her out, end the problem permanently with numbers she couldn't counter. "She'll see us coming," someone pointed out. "She'll disappear into the swamp." "Then we follow," Fortier said. "Enough men to cover every route, every crossing. We flood the swamp with riders. Nowhere to hide when the entire territory is occupied." The plan had risks. Organizing 300 men required public notice. But Fortier framed it as community protection, a demonstration of resolve against criminal elements. The language was careful, the intent clear. They set the date. September 18th, 1872. Full moon, dry season, conditions that favored attackers over defenders. They'd gather at the Mercier barn at sunset, ride together, surround the shack, and finish what Joseph Boudreau's murder had started. Fortier made one error. He discussed the plan at his dinner table in front of his house staff. His cook, a freedwoman named Celeste, heard every detail. She told her sister. Her sister told Delphine. Delphine walked 3 miles to the swamp's edge the next morning and called Miriam's name into the trees. Miriam appeared like she'd been waiting. Delphine delivered the warning. 300 men, September 18th, coming to burn her out. She begged Miriam to leave, to flee to New Orleans or Texas, to abandon whatever revenge she'd been extracting. Miriam listened. Then she smiled for the first time in 2 years. "Tell them I'll be home," she said. Miriam had spent 2 years preparing for individual targets. Now she had 3 weeks to prepare for an army. The task would have been impossible for someone unfamiliar with the terrain, for someone who knew every tree and crossing, who'd spent 700 days studying the land. It was simply work. She began with the trails. 5 routes led from solid ground toward her deeper camps. She'd marked them all previously, but now she adjusted them. The main trail, the most obvious route, she left intact but modified. Every 100 yards, she identified choke points, places where thick vegetation forced riders into single file, and above these she rigged deadfalls. Nothing elaborate. Logs balanced on wedges, held with rope that could be cut from a distance. Let the weight do the work. The false trails needed enhancement. She widened their entrances slightly, made them look more traveled, added hoof prints from her own horse walking the roads. 50 yards in, they led to flooded areas where the water looked shallow but wasn't, where horses would flounder and riders would dismount into waist-deep mud. She seeded the territory with objects designed to provoke paranoia. White fabric cut into hood shapes, placed in trees where moonlight would catch them. Burned crosses, small ones, appearing in clearings overnight. Not threats, invitations. Make them think they were entering her territory, seeing her marks, getting close. The wells were next. Not the obvious water sources, but the hidden springs frequented by hunters and trappers. She carried clay jugs filled with water she'd boiled with oleander leaves. Let cool, sealed. Enough to contaminate a water source for hours before the current diluted it. Not lethal doses, but enough to cause cramping, disorientation, panic. An army that can't trust its water is an army half defeated. She built more platforms in the trees, positioning them to cover the likely assembly points. 20 feet up, braced between branches, invisible unless you knew where to look and looked up. She cached supplies at each: dried fish, water, extra ammunition for the revolver. You couldn't know which platform you'd need until the attack developed. The pits needed multiplication. She dug 30 more, shallow graves really, along the routes she expected riders to take when they scattered. Covered with grass and leaves, they waited for boots and hooves. At the bottom of some, she placed thorns from hawthorn trees, points upward. At others, nothing but mud and standing water. Variation kept pursuers guessing which risk they faced. She prepared the shack itself, the structure they'd come to burn. She removed everything personal, everything that mattered. Joseph's carved name on the oak was permanent, but his clothes, his tools, the quilt his mother had sewn, these went to Delphine for safekeeping. What remained was wood and tar paper, a shell, a decoy. Inside the shack, she left signs of habitation. A cold fire pit with recent ashes, a dress hanging on a peg, a half-eaten meal on the table. She wanted them to believe she was there, had been there recently, would return. Beside the front door, she positioned a lantern with a long wick, oil reservoir, filled, ready to light. Visible from a distance, it would draw them in. The final preparation was the boy. His name was Baptiste, 14 years old, mute since birth, nephew to Delphine. He lived in the quarter, helped with odd jobs, and was known as simple but reliable. Miriam asked Delphine if Baptiste could help her, explained what she needed, and promised he'd be safe. Delphine agreed because she understood this was beyond individual revenge now. This was demonstration. Miriam spent 3 days teaching Baptiste the routes, showing him which trails were safe and which ones led to traps. She gave him simple instructions. When the riders come, be seen, then run. Lead them deeper into the swamp, but only on the marked paths. She showed him the notches that meant safety and the notches that meant danger. Baptiste learned quickly. He couldn't speak, but his eyes showed understanding. September 17th arrived. Miriam sent word through the quarter's network. Anyone who doesn't want to witness what's coming should leave town tomorrow. She didn't explain further. By the next morning, 20 families had packed essentials and departed for relatives' homes in the next parish. Those who stayed did so with doors barred and lamps extinguished. Miriam spent the final night at her deep camp, checking preparations, running through contingencies. She'd been patient for 2 years. Now patience would combine with preparation, and 300 men would learn what one woman with time and terrain could accomplish. 9 names remained on her list. By tomorrow, she intended to reduce that number significantly. The riders began assembling at the Mercier barn 2 hours before sunset on September 18, 1872. They came from across Terrebonne Parish and beyond, some from neighboring parishes, where clan chapters had heard about the swamp witch problem and wanted to participate in its solution. What started as Fortier's plan for overwhelming force became a spectacle, a demonstration of white power that attracted every man who owned a horse and a grievance. By the time the sun touched the western horizon, over 300 riders crowded the fields around the barn. They wore their hoods and robes, a sea of white fabric that reflected the dying light like baptismal cloth. They carried torches, rifles, rope, and confidence. The mood was celebratory. Men who'd been frightened individually felt invincible collectively. They shared whiskey from past bottles, told stories about previous raids, made jokes about the woman they were hunting. Fortier addressed them from horseback, his voice carrying across the assembly. He spoke of tradition, of civilization, of the necessity of maintaining order through strength. He described Miriam Boudreau, though he didn't use her name, just the Negro woman at Swamp's Edge, as a murderer, a threat, an example that required correction. He framed the night's work as justice, as community protection, as righteous action. Nobody mentioned the 6 dead Klansmen. Nobody mentioned Joseph Boudreau. The narrative had been simplified into heroes and villains, civilization and savagery, and the outcome was predetermined. 300 men against 1 woman. Mathematics favored the cavalry. They rode out at full dark, a column that stretched a quarter mile. Fortier led from the front, flanked by his most experienced knights. Behind them came the rank and file, farmers and shopkeepers and mill workers who'd taken up the hood because it gave them power they lacked individually. At the rear came stragglers, drunker than the rest, louder, the kind of men who joined movements for the violence rather than the ideology. The column followed the main road west toward the swamp, torches creating a river of fire visible from miles away. They weren't hiding. They wanted Miriam to see them coming, wanted her to understand the futility of resistance. Overwhelming force works partly through application and partly through display. They reached Miriam's shack at 9:30 p.m. The structure sat in its clearing, looking exactly as it had for 2 years. Small, leaning, lit by a single lantern in the front window. Fortier called a halt 200 yards out, organizing his force into a surrounding perimeter. He positioned men in concentric rings, each ring closer than the last, tightening the noose until nothing could escape. The outer ring extended into the swamp itself. Riders positioned along the trails and crossings Fortier knew from maps, though he'd never walked them himself. He sent scouts ahead to confirm the shack was occupied, to watch for movement, to report back before the final approach. The scouts returned within minutes. Lanterns lit, smoke from the chimney, someone's inside. Fortier smiled. She was there. The hunt was over. He signaled the advance. The inner rings moved forward on foot, torches held high, weapons ready. They surrounded the shack completely, 100 men forming a wall between Miriam and every direction of escape. Fortier himself approached the door, flanked by 4 knights, and hammered his rifle butt against the wood. "Come out! You're surrounded! There's no escape!" Silence from inside. No movement, no response. Fortier hammered again. "Come out or we burn you out! Your choice!" Still nothing. Fortier nodded to his men. 2 of them kicked the door open, rushed inside with torches and rifles, ready for confrontation. They found an empty room. No Miriam, no occupant. Just the lantern burning, the fire dying in the hearth, and a dress hanging on its peg like a shed skin. Baptiste appeared at the clearing's edge exactly when Miriam had told him to appear. He'd been waiting in the shadows, watching the riders surround the shack, counting until the moment felt right. Then he stepped into torchlight. A thin black boy in ragged clothes, eyes wide, turning to run the instant they spotted him. "There! Someone's running!" 20 riders broke from the perimeter, pursuing on foot because horses couldn't navigate the thick undergrowth. Baptiste ran with the practiced clumsiness of someone trying to be caught, but not immediately, staying visible, leading them deeper. Behind him, the riders crashed through palmetto and saw grass, their torches creating a moving constellation of fire. Baptiste followed the path Miriam had shown him, the one marked with correct notches, the one that led into the swamp's interior on solid ground that wouldn't swallow boots. The riders behind him followed, assuming terrain that supported a running boy would support pursuing men. Their assumption lasted until the first man stepped through grass that looked solid, but wasn't, breaking through into a pit that caught him to the waist. He screamed, dropped his torch, and those behind him veered around, now more cautious, but still pursuing. Miriam watched from her platform in a live oak 40 feet above the trail. The branch beneath her was wide as a man's chest, stable enough for hours of motionless waiting. She'd positioned herself here 3 hours before sunset, climbing in daylight when movement was easier, settling into the crook where thick growth hid her completely. Now she had clear sight lines on the trail below and the riders stumbling along it. Baptiste disappeared around a bend, leading his pursuers deeper. Miriam let them pass. These weren't her targets. These were the followers, the drunk stragglers, the men who'd joined for excitement. She was waiting for leaders. Back at the shack, Fortier organized a systematic search. He sent riders down each visible trail, teams of 10 to avoid isolation, each team with torches and strict orders. Find the woman, find anyone helping her, report back before engaging. He positioned the bulk of his force in a holding perimeter, ready to collapse on whichever direction produced results. The teams departed down 5 different trails. Miriam had anticipated this. 4 of those trails led to her prepared zones. The 5th led safely away, toward the eastern parish line, an escape route that would let some riders survive to carry the story. Team 1 followed the northern trail, which Miriam had widened to look promising. 200 yards in, the trail narrowed to a choke point between 2 large cypresses. Above, balanced on wedges, a deadfall log waited. Miriam had rigged 3 of these along the trail, each with a rope running up to her platforms. She'd positioned herself where she could reach all 3 ropes without moving more than 10 feet. She waited until Team 1's forward scouts passed beneath the first deadfall, then cut the rope. The log dropped, crashing down across the trail, not hitting anyone directly, but creating an obstacle and panic. The teams scattered, some forward, some back, discipline fragmenting instantly. In the confusion, Miriam dropped from her platform to a lower branch, then to ground level behind the scattered team. She moved through shadows, using the same skills she'd employed during the war. Silence, patience, striking when attention was elsewhere. She chose a straggler who'd separated from his group, a man fumbling with his rifle while looking at the fallen log. Her knife was quick and quiet. She left him where he fell and melted back into darkness before anyone noticed. Team 2 encountered the contaminated well 20 minutes into their search. They'd been riding hard, and when they found clear spring water, they drank deeply, filling canteens. The oleander took 30 minutes to work. By then they were 2 miles in, and the cramping and disorientation began to scatter them. Some tried to ride back. Others dismounted, convinced the horses were causing the dizziness. Several wandered off alone, seeking privacy for violent intestinal distress. They became easy targets for a woman who'd been watching their positions the entire time. The night devolved into chaos Miriam had designed. Riders calling for teammates who didn't answer. Horses returning without riders. Torches extinguished in struggles, leaving men in absolute darkness among trees that all looked identical. And through it all, Miriam moved, sometimes visible for an instant. A shadow that vanished before rifles could aim. Sometimes completely invisible, known only by the men who disappeared when groups fragmented. The psychological break happened around midnight. Teams that had entered the swamp with confidence and numbers began encountering each other in the dark, and fear made recognition difficult. A group moving north heard movement in the brush and opened fire, killing 2 riders from another team before realizing their mistake. The living fled, spreading word that the witch could make men see enemies everywhere. Fortier tried to maintain order from the clearing, sending runners to recall teams. But the runners themselves disappeared into the swamp's confusion. By 1 in the morning, riders were returning on their own, babbling about trails that looped back on themselves, water that appeared from nowhere, trees marked with symbols that seemed to move when you looked away. Supernatural explanations flowered where rational ones failed. The truth was simpler. Miriam had marked false trails with notches similar to her safe routes, slightly different, enough to confuse pursuers who half remembered what correct marks looked like. She'd created loops using natural landmarks, making riders think they'd covered distance when they'd only circled. And she'd used the territory's natural disorientation, the darkness, the vegetation, the water reflecting torchlight in confusing ways, to amplify mistakes. She'd also been methodical about targeting leaders. When she took men, she chose those giving orders, those organizing searches, those others looked to for guidance. Remove leadership and even disciplined groups fragment. The Clan's 300 weren't disciplined. They were a mob held together by shared identity and confidence. Remove the confidence and the mob became individuals, each acting from fear. By 2 a.m., Fortier had lost count of who'd returned and who hadn't. Men staggered into the clearing with stories of ambush, of traps, of a woman who seemed to be everywhere simultaneously. Some claimed she commanded alligators. Others swore they'd seen her walking on water. A few insisted she could pass through trees like smoke. Fear had transformed observation into mythology, and mythology was contagious. Fortier made a decision. They would burn the swamp. If they couldn't find Miriam through pursuit, they'd destroy her territory with fire. He organized men to spread out along the swamp's edge with torches, to light the vegetation and let the fire push inward, forcing anything inside toward open ground where rifles waited. They started the fires at 3 a.m. Dry season made the vegetation combustible. Within minutes, flames spread along the swamp's eastern edge, creating a wall of heat and light that began advancing west. Smoke billowed upward, visible for miles. Fortier watched from horseback, satisfied. No woman could survive this. The swamp would burn, and with it, their problem. But Miriam had anticipated fire. She'd spent 2 years studying the swamp's hydrology, understanding that while vegetation looked dry, the standing water underneath created natural fire breaks. She'd also cleared lanes in strategic locations, invisible from ground level but functional from above, creating channels where fire would advance, split, and exhaust itself in wet zones. She watched the fires from her deepest camp, on the hammock surrounded by black water. The flames came close enough that smoke made breathing difficult, but the water barrier held. The fire consumed several acres of sawgrass and palmetto, drove wildlife into terrified flight, and created spectacular destruction. What it didn't do was reach Miriam or her prepared positions. What the fire did accomplish was marking the survivors. When dawn broke on September 19th, the men who staggered out of the smoke were burned, exhausted, and broken. Fortier counted them as they emerged. Roughly 200 of his original 300 were accounted for. The rest were missing, scattered, dead, or fled individually during the night. Sheriff Vickers arrived at dawn with a deputy, drawn by the smoke visible from town. He found the clearing full of riders collapsing from exhaustion, horses standing riderless, and Gaston Fortier sitting on the shack's porch with his head in his hands. The Grand Cyclops who'd organized this demonstration of overwhelming force looked defeated in ways that had nothing to do with physical injury. Vickers surveyed the scene, noted the burned swampland still smoking, and asked the question everyone knew was coming. "Where's the woman?" Nobody could answer. She'd been there. The evidence was everywhere, in the bodies they'd recovered, in the traps they'd encountered, in the absolute precision with which she'd dismantled their attack. But where she was now, after a night of executing a defense that had collapsed 300 men into chaos, nobody knew. The accounting took 3 days. Families reported men missing. Search parties found some bodies in the swamp. Men who'd drowned in pits, who'd bled out from injuries sustained in falls, who'd died from contaminated water or injuries inflicted by someone skilled with a blade. The official count reached 17 dead, 43 injured seriously enough to require medical attention, and 8 who vanished completely and were never found. The Weekly Register struggled with how to report it. Editor Pike understood that describing the truth, that a single black woman had defeated 300 armed white men, would humiliate the parish beyond recovery. But ignoring 17 deaths was impossible. He settled on a compromise. Tragic fire in western swamps claims multiple lives. Investigation continues into accidental deaths during nighttime search operation. The Klan's version circulated through different channels. Fortier tried to maintain the witch narrative, claiming supernatural forces had defended the swamp, that no woman could have accomplished what happened without dark assistance. This preserved some dignity. Losing to the devil was less shameful than losing to someone you'd claimed was inferior. But the Freedmen's Quarter knew. They'd known Miriam's capabilities since the war. They'd watched her disappear and understood what she was preparing. Now they watched the Klan survivors return broken, and the knowledge spread. One woman with patience and intelligence had beaten an army that relied on numbers and intimidation. The story passed through networks the white community couldn't access, across parishes, through Louisiana and beyond. The woman who hunted Klansmen. The woman who turned her land into a weapon. The woman who refused to be erased. Vickers made half-hearted efforts to find Miriam, leading searches through the burned sections of swamp, questioning families in the quarter who claimed ignorance. He filed reports documenting his investigation, knowing they satisfied bureaucratic requirements without requiring actual results. By October, the search was quietly abandoned. Miriam Boudreau remained at large, status unknown, threat level reduced, now that the Klan had learned its lesson. The lesson was effective. Klan activity in Terrebonne Parish dropped dramatically after September 18th. Raids stopped completely for 6 months. Meetings became smaller, more cautious. The organization that had terrorized the parish for 4 years discovered that terror worked both directions, and the fear they'd created had metastasized into something that hunted them back. Gaston Fortier resigned as Grand Cyclops in November. He claimed business obligations required his attention, but everyone understood. He'd led 300 men into a swamp and brought back 200, and the 100 missing were his responsibility. He retreated to his plantation, rarely left his property, and died in 1877 from what his doctor called exhaustion and what others recognized as defeat. Of the 9 names remaining on Miriam's list, 3 died in the September attack, confirming they'd been among the riders. 4 others left Terrebonne Parish within weeks, relocating to Texas or Mississippi or Arkansas, running from a threat they couldn't see but knew was present. The final 2 remained, but changed their behavior entirely. No more raids, no more meetings, no public association with the Klan. They'd calculated survival required invisibility. Joseph Boudreau's murder had been avenged, not through courts or law, but through a widow's patience and a swamp's geography. 13 men had killed him. 13 debts had been paid, some in the clearing, some in the years before, all recorded in memory carved into cypress bark. Miriam emerged from the swamp in November of 1872, 2 months after the September attack. She appeared in Grantville's Market Square on a Saturday morning, walking through the Freedmen's Quarter like she'd only been gone for days instead of 2 years. She wore clean clothes, carried a basket for shopping, and acknowledged neighbors with calm nods. The white community's reaction was confused. Some wanted her arrested, but for what crime? No evidence connected her to the Klansmen's deaths beyond rumor and assumption. The hoods found at death sites bore no fingerprints. The traps in the swamp were on her property, legally owned, arguably defensive. And the 17 men who died on September 18th had been trespassing on private land while armed, making prosecution complicated even if evidence existed. Sheriff Vickers visited her rebuilt shack in December. She'd reconstructed it on the same foundation, slightly larger, more solid. He found her on the porch, shelling peas, and asked directly, "Did you kill those men?" "I defended my property, Sheriff. My husband is buried under that oak. You think I should have let them burn him out of the ground?" 17 dead, Miss Miriam. That's not defense, that's justice, she interrupted, since you weren't providing it. Vickers had no answer. He filed another report documenting his conversation, noting Miss Boudreau's continued residence at Swamp's Edge, concluding no arrest was warranted at this time. He never visited her again. The community adjusted to her presence through studied avoidance. White folks crossed the street when she walked through town. Shopkeepers served her quickly, relieved when she left. The implicit understanding, "We won't prosecute, you won't continue," a truce born from fear disguised as mercy. The Freedmen's Quarter treated her differently. She became a figure of quiet respect, a woman who'd done what courts wouldn't, who demonstrated that power had limits and patience had teeth. Families brought her food, helped repair her property, included her in the community's network. She attended church on Sundays, sitting in the back, singing hymns in a voice that carried sorrow and steel in equal measure. She lived at Swamp's Edge for 30 more years, aging into someone the parish couldn't forget, but couldn't quite acknowledge. She died in 1902 at age 62, buried beside Joseph under the live oak she'd defended. Her funeral drew 200 people, all black, all understanding what she represented. No white officials attended. No newspaper reported her death. She passed from life to legend without official recognition, which seemed appropriate for someone who'd operated outside official channels. The Klan never recovered its pre-September dominance in Terrebonne Parish. Oh, it persisted. Night riding resumed in 1873. Violence continued in cycles. But the absolute confidence was gone. Miriam had demonstrated vulnerability, had shown that terror could be answered with strategy, that numbers meant nothing against preparation and knowledge. Her story spread beyond Louisiana through networks the white authorities never understood. Freedmen traveling for work carried the tale. Church congregations shared it as testimony. The details changed with each telling. Some versions made her 10 feet tall, others gave her literal magical powers. But the core remained. A woman who refused to accept her husband's murder, who used intelligence instead of rage, who survived by understanding that patience defeats impulse. The swamp itself became a place of caution. Hunters and trappers who'd worked the territory for years reported feeling watched, even decades after September 18th. Probably psychological, probably the knowledge of what had happened there creating hypervigilance. Or maybe Miriam's defenses remained, slowly decaying but still functional, still making the land remember. Historical record is fragmentary. The Weekly Register's archive, donated to the parish library in 1938, contains gaps around September 1872. Pages missing. Issues lost. Judge Chevalier's court records show no prosecutions related to the incident. The Klan kept no written history of the night 300 men learned that overwhelming force could be overwhelmed. What survives is oral history, passed through generations, distorted by time, but preserving truth in the distortion. Great-grandchildren of Grantville's freedmen community still tell the story, still point to the oak where Joseph Boudreau is buried, still describe the night the swamp fought back. Modern historians debate whether Miriam acted alone or had help from other freedmen, whether the death count was 17 or higher, whether the traps were as elaborate as legend claims. The debates miss the point. Miriam Boudreau existed. Her husband was murdered. Klansmen died under circumstances that terrified their brotherhood. Those facts are documented. The rest is interpretation, and interpretation says more about interpreters than about truth. The shack at Swamp's Edge rotted into the ground by 1920. The land passed through various hands, eventually became part of a nature preserve. The live oak still stands, over 200 years old now, carrying scars from names carved into its bark. Joseph's name is still visible if you know where to look. Some claim a second name appears beside it, though records don't confirm Miriam ever carved her own. The last person who claimed to see Miriam alive was a girl named Evangeline Theriot, who was 8 years old in 1902 when she wandered away from her family's farm into the swamp. Search parties found her 2 days later, unharmed, sitting on a fallen log eating blackberries. She told them an old black woman had led her to safety, had shown her which paths were solid and which weren't, had given her water and berries, and told her stories about a man named Joseph who'd loved wildflowers. By the time searchers followed Evangeline's directions to thank the woman, they found only an abandoned camp with a cold fire pit and footprints leading deeper into territory, where ground and water became indistinguishable. On a clear night in the swamp near Grantville, locals still avoid the western sections where the cypress grows thick, where trails loop back on themselves, where something in the darkness feels like it's watching with the patience of someone who spent 2 years learning how to wait. Subscribe if you want the next deep dive.